people are very interested in this topic of teens. Teens are a difficult developmental stage at the best of times, and I think COVID has just made that more difficult. We've had a lot of parents, complaining particularly about sleep schedules. If teens were nocturnal before COVID really exacerbated that, and so that's why we devoted the second talk in this series to sleep and schedules for teens, and my colleague Julia Katzman will be presenting on that a week from today. My name is Ned Presnall. I'm the owner and director of Plan Your Recovery. We treat addiction primarily in adolescents and adults. We have very different programs for each of those groups. Today we're just excited to have you all to talk about teens. So the way that this series will go, today I'm going to lay the groundwork on contingency management and some of the principles of contingency management. And then next week, Julia will apply those principles to sleep and schedule among teens. And in the last talk, we'll really address the hard stuff, the addiction, how we treat addiction with contingency management, both substance use disorders and also what has become, a more focused topic these days is the screen addiction, how to deal with overuse of screens, both video games and other types of screen addiction. So I'm just going to get started. So the way I see being a parent is that we have two main jobs. The first one is to delight in our children. And that's the deeply personal part of the work. We're the only people really that can mirror back to our children, a view of them, expression of delight in them that will become so integral to their sense of self, to their belief that they're likable or lovable. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. That's a deeply personal job that only we can do as parents. Obviously, they get that mirrored back in other relationships, but we're the first and the most fundamental. The second part is to help our kids learn to successfully navigate the impersonal world. And I really think in a sense, the art of parenting is to keep these two major tasks of parenting separate, to keep the personal and the impersonal. And so I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. When I was a social work student, I worked with John Constantino briefly. I really thought when I went into social work, I was going to work in child maltreatment, and he was developing programs to try to prevent child maltreatment in families that were high risk for maltreatment because they'd been identified as already having a child maltreatment case. So he developed a synchrony program that's still used at WashU Psychiatry. And I remember one of the early groups I went to, he was doing a parent-child interaction training with really young kids from like 0 to 4. And he was trying to teach mothers who were in treatment for addiction to just respond to their children in developmentally appropriate ways and to build attachment. It was all based on kind of attachment theory. The idea being that if you build a solid attachment, it really helps with emotional regulation and the development of identity and sense of self. And I just remember him taking this little baby and laying this infant of 3, 4, 5 months down on their backs and asking the mother to come and show the rest of the group what happened when the mother leaned her face in and made eye contact with the baby. And when she did that, you could see all of the muscles in this baby just like vibrate, just like kind of tense up. You just saw how like this deeply physical connection that came from the mother's gaze meeting the infant's gaze. And, from that point, and then I studied a lot of attachment theory after that, and I worked in the Incredible Years Parent Training Interventions. And something I always just took with me was this idea that from that first moment that they enter the world, all through their childhood and development, just the almost infinite number of times that a child looks to the parent to receive something back. that their gaze meets our gaze. And I thought, gosh, that's one of our major roles in the child's life, is to meet that gaze that we get hundreds of times a day. With my 4 and my 7-year-old, hundreds of times a day, they look to me, and what do they get? And I think if we can do nothing else throughout the whole course of development, when we see that gaze meet ours, to show delight in our child, that is like this is the same as giving them, vegetables to eat and fruit to eat. It's like the nourishment of the attachment through sending them the message that they're likable, that they're lovable, that there's something delightful in them. And it costs nothing in the sense that they don't earn it. It's just that because they're our child and we see the goodness in them, we delight in them, we love them. But if parenting were just that, in some sense, that would be easy. Now, it wouldn't be easy at those times that we don't like our children, and those times come up too. But what's really challenging about parenting, and it becomes especially challenging with teens, is that there's this impersonal aspect. When I work with young adults, and I use more crude language than I'll use today, I say, if they're struggling to launch into adulthood and we're focusing on this transitional problem, this transitional stage, I said, look, you are making one of the hardest transitions of human life. You are moving from getting everything that you need to survive and to live from people who love you unconditionally to a world that doesn't give an F about you. And that is hard. And in some sense, as parents, we're trying to prepare the child for that transition. We're trying to delight in them and show them how lovable they are and how likable they are. And yet we also have to prepare them that the world is not going to see them that way. We want to help them develop an internal positive sense of self. They also have to deal with rules and demands and requirements. And we have to, and that's a challenging part of parenting. So when I moved to St. Louis and I got my first job at Boys Hope, Girls Hope, when I first arrived as a house parent, this was before I went to social work school. When I got there were 6 kids in the house and 4 house parents. There was a really high ratio of house parents to kids, and the house parents would rotate on shifts and such. And the job, when I first got there, when the house parents would wake up every morning, there was a ritual that they would go through, where they would each assign themselves a child or 2, and they'd go upstairs and they'd get these teenage boys and they'd wake them up. And then they'd go back up and keep nagging and nagging and nagging. Say, you've got to get down to the car. You've got to get down to the car. And, it would escalate, and the kids would roll back over and go to sleep. And the house parents would go up and they'd pull the covers off of the kid. It was just this power struggle around getting to the van to go to school. I actually got an email from a parent this morning saying that they're having this, when they saw that this talk was going on, they're having this struggle getting their kids to go to school when it's a school day or an in-person school day, and getting on the computer when it's a computer day. It was just this power struggle every morning. So this is a common problem. And so I sat down with all the house parents. I said, this isn't tenable. we can't live this way, starting every day with this massive power struggle. First of all, it takes away our capacity to spend time delighting in these kids who need us to be delighting in them. So the impersonal world, takes over the personal. We take it personally that they don't listen to us. We get angry. We're frustrated. There's resentment. And it's just not obviously teaching them well. So I said, why don't we just get them all alarm clocks? And this will sound so simple. We'll get them all alarm clocks, and we'll tell them what time the van is leaving. And because we take them all to their schools that they went to, which are all in the area around Boys Hope, Girls Hope. And if they don't make it to the van in time, we'll leave, and we'll let them know that if they get left behind, that the van will come back and do a second round. But in that second round, obviously, they'll be late for school, and they'll just face whatever consequences they face at school. So everybody agreed that we would try this. People weren't necessarily sure that it would work. Maybe they'll just all stay in bed all day, right? Maybe that's what would happen. But in that first week that we implemented this, the kids were left behind twice. And after that first week, they were never left behind. They just started regulating themselves. because when they got to school, there were natural consequences they didn't want to face. They didn't want to be in detention, and all the schools that they went to had detention if you were late. And all of a sudden, this thing that was so personal, and this huge power struggle became impersonal, and it was treated now as a part of the universe. Now, at that time, we were trained in that particular program in something called therapeutic crisis intervention. And one of the principles of therapeutic crisis intervention was to treat the rules and the demands of the world, even the ones that you set up as a parent, as impersonal, and to save all of your personalization and emotion for the positive interactions with kids. And so it basically fit into that framework. One more example of this, I'll share with you just because it was striking to me that it worked out this way. Another experience I had was I taught at a school called Verbum Dei in South Central Los Angeles. And this school was about to close. The diocese was going to close it. And I was a Jesuit at the time. I was a Jesuit for 5 years, for whom that is meaningful. A teacher who taught me school at Jesuit High School in Sacramento was recruited to come down and teach at the school when the Jesuits took over. It was a school that was really just kind of a mess. It wasn't well run. And the Jesuits were going to try to make it better run and make it survive. And to this day, it's still running. So this teacher that taught for a semester and said, I can't do it. He was getting a bit older, and he just couldn't take how difficult the behaviors of the kids were. And that wasn't the kids' fault. It was just that there was really poor structure at the school. And so they said, okay, Ned, 24 years old, you're going to go in there and you're going to teach this next semester. So I found this book. When I arrived, I found this book called Unassumingly Tools for Teaching by Fred Jones. And you'd think, well, that doesn't sound like that would save you. But this book was simply about classroom management and how you kept emotion out of managing the classroom. And it took you teachers step by step on how to prevent themselves from going into their limbic system when kids started to test them throughout the classroom, and also how to use the least amount of energy possible to get the response they wanted from kids. I mean, it really is a masterclass in self-behavioral management to deal with challenging situations. So I read that and I internalized it, and I went into the school, and it truly saved me. It was so anti-intuitive. I certainly couldn't have done it without the training or without the ideas in my mind. But it helped me to run the classroom well and helped me build positive relationships with the teens. But on one particular instance, I started running detention then. That became another one of my jobs, to run detention for the whole school, because prior to that, there was no disciplinary program, nothing that teachers could say, hey, you get detention if you do X, Y, or Z. There was no contingencies. And so students had to adjust to the fact that now there were. And there was this one student, Marcus, who I met when he was first coming to the school that year because he came late. And I was in a meeting with the dean who was trying to help him integrate back into school because he himself had been in jail. And so he got out of jail and he was coming back to school, and we were trying to make sure that he got connected well. So that was the only time I met him. And then I taught freshmen and sophomores, and he was a senior, so I never saw him after that. But one day towards the end of the semester I was there, he came into my classroom and immediately started going off on me. He's like, Brother Presnall, this is ridiculous. F and this and F and that, and we can't have detention. This teacher gave me detention. I've been here 4 years. We don't have detention at this school. I'm not coming to your detention. And I'm sitting there, and I was like, I was tired. It was the end of the day. The classroom was empty. And, I just kind of thought about like how I was training myself to respond. And I said, hey, Marcus, because I knew it wasn't personal. He wasn't mad at me. We didn't have a relationship that he was even, could even make personal. And I said, hey, you can do whatever you want. I get it. This is a big change at your school. But let me tell you the few things I think will happen if you come to detention and if you don't. If you come to detention, it's over. And you've met your obligation and you go on. But if you don't come, I've read the policy, and here's where I'm making it impersonal, right? And the policy says that, if you miss one detention, you get 3 detentions. And if you miss those detentions, you got to go before the dean, and they're liable to suspend you. And you're right at the end of graduating. You're right close to graduation. So I think you're going to cause yourself a lot of headaches. But by all means, you have the information now. Do what you're going to do. So I didn't get an immediate positive response. He stormed out and slammed the door, and he went away. And I thought to myself, I'm never going to see that kid again. The first time I met him, he was dealing with rules that were way more important than the rules of the classroom. He was getting out of jail. He is obviously dealing with stuff in his life that was much more important than my detention classroom. And I didn't really blame him for that. But about 15 minutes later, he came back, he opened the door, and he said, Brother Presnell, in a completely changed tone. Brother Presnell, what time did you say detention was? And I'm like, whatever, 3:20, 3:50, whatever. And he showed up on time, he sat in his chair, and he left. And from that point on, when he saw me, he would greet me in the hallways, right? For some reason, somehow, just by not personalizing his frustration with the system, he developed a relationship with me. It was an important relationship. It was just a respectful relationship, one in which, and yet I knew from how how the school had been operating, and I could imagine in his life a couple of things. One is he was probably used to people personalizing things when he got upset like that. It's a natural thing to do. I do it all the time, with my own kids and in my own life. And yet, he also, if I would have personalized it in that moment, I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty convinced if I said, hey, when you walked in, hey, you can't treat me that way. You can't talk to me that way. I'm a teacher. If I had gotten all personal and upset about it, then he would have stormed out, and that would have been the end of it. And that would have given him in his mind, I think, justification for, hey, well, Brother Presnell said these things to me, and I'm not going to that detention. But by making the rules and the contingencies impersonal, it allowed him to relate to those and to make a better choice than if the choice had been about me and him. So basically that, I think, is the art of parenting, is keeping the impersonal and keeping the personal very personal, and continuing that work of delighting in the child. When we're tired, overworked, overwhelmed, we all get personal about the impersonal. There's no avoiding that. But if we can keep tacking the boat back to what we're aiming for, we can do our best with our kids. Teens are the most challenging. Well, they and toddlers are the most challenging, but the teens and toddlers are the most challenging because they are wired to test boundaries. They're wired to explore. They're wired to take risks. They're wired to take risks in such a way that they need parents, in some sense, helping them regulate their lives and the boundaries more than other age groups do. Now, this varies a lot from kid to kid, but teens are definitely a highly exploratory time. And teens are also going through another process that toddlers are not yet going through as meaningfully. They're starting to see themselves as the primary authority in their lives more and more. And that's right. I mean, ultimately, they've already taken over a lot of things. They've decided more what they're going to eat, who they're going to spend time with, when they're going to come and go. All of these things start to become more and more part of the authority in their lives. We still have authority, but that authority is gradually being displaced by their authority in their own lives. And yet, we don't have full confidence, as teens are also risk-taking, that we can just kind of lay off, and we shouldn't. There's two main mistakes we can make with teenagers. One is to be too rigid, which I'm going to talk about, and the other is to be too permissive, to say, well, they're their own person now, they've just kind of got to do it all themselves, and so they come and go, and we're not sure if they're using marijuana or vaping. They're old enough now, they're going to have to make those decisions themselves. That also can lead to problems, especially with teens that have addictive oriented characteristics, which we'll talk about in the last webinar. So it's a challenge. We're on the one hand taking a step back, allowing them to have more responsibility, more authority in their own lives, and yet they're testing boundaries in a way that make us want to be authoritative to protect them. Not for any bad reason, but we want to keep giving them rich experiences, so we want to make sure they're meeting their obligations. We want to make sure they're not doing anything too risky. We want to keep them safe. And yet we're in this very difficult dance with them around their authority and our authority. And so if a teen tests their boundaries with us and we respond authoritatively, that's when things start to get personal. The teen gets personal, the parent gets personal, and now we've got this power struggle around some area of their life. And when we see that start to happen with a teen, that's when we just need to step back and say, okay, how do I depersonalize the conflict we're having? Because the conflict is obviously about what they want to do and what we want them to do. And that is something that can be negotiated. And when you move out of that kind of personal authoritative stance and say, okay, I still am an authority in my teen's life, but I need to let them come to the table and negotiate. Now you've created a space in which you and the teen can try to make things much more impersonal. The other thing that happens, that I see this a lot with parents that come in, will so often say to me, oh gosh, Ned, the behavior that, like, whatever they did is challenging and is difficult, but the thing I have the most time with is that they've been lying to me. And some parents are even afraid that their kid is becoming, developing really like antisocial traits because they're lying, and they're really scared to see this kind of trait developing in their child. Well, lying is a bad behavior, but it's also the way that a person with less authority claims autonomy. It's sort of an immature way to claim autonomy from a person who has authority over us. And in that sense, it's really not personal, and it's not necessarily reflective of a more persistent characterological trait. So, all teens, in order to start developing more autonomy, more privacy, when they feel like they can make a decision in their lives that they really see no reason they shouldn't make themselves. Maybe they are out with their friends maybe they're out with their friends and nobody's doing anything wrong. And they're just having a good time and hanging out and talking, and they feel safe. They know they can get home safely. And yet there's this arbitrary rule that they have to be home in 15 minutes. And now they have a choice to submit to the authority of their parents. And maybe they call and their parents say, no, you got to be home. Or they know that will happen, or they think that will happen. And then they're sitting there and they say, well, they don't say this consciously, but on some sense they're saying, like, well, maybe my authority about whether or not I can be up for another hour is more important than my parents' belief in that regard. Right? And so without any compunction or anything, it's not like they think, I need to lie to my parents, or I'm going to get one over on them, or I'm going to disobey my parents. They're not thinking about the parents at all. They're just feeling their own authority, and they're looking around and being like, I can choose to be out in another hour. And then they do. But in order to prevent conflict, especially if they have very authoritarian parents, they lie. And that lying is a way to protect the autonomy that they're trying to create in their own life. It's not always good. I mean, in the worst cases, that autonomy could be the autonomy to use drugs. And that's an autonomy we actually have to try to mitigate with kids. But in a lot of areas, it isn't bad. It's just that the kid wants to do something differently than what the parent would imagine or would feel most comfortable with. Actually, I'll give you a good example of this. Recently, I was working with a family, and this is where this claim for autonomy changes quite a bit from 14 to 18. I mean, it's actually obviously happens much earlier than that. When even from a young age, kids will lay claim to certain areas of autonomy in their lives, and we can create lots of unnecessary conflict if we don't recognize, their authority in their own lives. My 5-year-old son laid claim very early on to dressing himself. It was important to him what he put on his body, and it was his body, right? And sometimes that would result in really funny outfits, but it was very important to him emotionally from age 2.5 years old, and it continues to be. And that's not a place where we've chosen to engage in a power struggle, because it's obviously just a place where he's feeling himself. So claiming autonomy, begins very early, but from 14 to 18, it escalates, and it often is around areas of life that are more problematic, right? Whether or not I'm going to use a substance, whether or not I'm going to stay out, whether or not I'm going to do my homework, what kids I'm going to spend time with, whether I'm going to call and check in, all of these areas that are associated with safety and some long-term developmental risks like substance use, how much I'm going to spend time on a screen. So, and so we're in this difficult role where we now have to negotiate with someone whose authority in their own lives is becoming greater than our own. But we still have a lot of leverage with them. So going back to this family, there was and I talk about this kind of 14 to 18 change, because this was a young woman who was 18 years old, and her parents came across a couple social media posts that they really were concerned about. And, these were posts that, were, glamour shots that the teen and her peers saw no trouble with. And the parents felt like, oh, this isn't appropriate. This shouldn't be on the internet. But it wasn't cut and dry. It wasn't like, everybody would look and agree that those shouldn't be up. But the parents felt really strongly about it. And the daughter's living at home still. And even though she's legally an adult, obviously she's still an adolescent. And so she, they put the full court press on her, and ultimately just forced her to take the pictures down. I can't remember exactly how they did it, but they forced her to take pictures down. Well, how do you think the daughter responded to that? That was clearly an area where, this is, they had discussed it. They disagreed on whether it was appropriate. And her peers were one authority in her life where she felt like she was getting approval, and her parents disapproved, and they, played the trump card. So after that, her, the next step she took was to just block them on her social media and block other family members on social media. So basically she went into the kind of subversive mode where, okay, if you're going to please me, then I'll just I'll go dark on you, and then I'll live my life. Ultimately, the important thing to realize in that situation is, you may be able to control those two pictures, but that ship has sailed now, right? Like and then the next 10 years of her life, there's going to be no control over what she does on social media. And so the authoritarian stance at that point over this particular issue, has played out. And really and this is what the parents and I talked about, that one thing that's affected by taking an authoritative stance at a point in which it's no longer developmentally effective, even if you're right, even if there's a real strength to the argument that these images shouldn't be up, is that it's not going to be practical going forward, and it's going to rupture communication between you and your teen during a period when you want to be able to talk to them meaningfully about choices like that. And so in that place, in that real transition from, teens to legal adulthood, the real work is on creating open lines of communication where you show respect for the teen's authority in their lives. You don't always agree with what they're doing around issues that are kind of gray area issues like that, yet you engage them in communication about, the pros and cons of those choices. Now, this family did something really amazing with this teen, where they, she'd also engaged in one other behavior that they considered risky. And instead of coming down hard on her and trying to prohibit the behavior, because they knew actually that they couldn't, they had her sit down with an expert in the area that she really, really respected, and had this really fruitful conversation. When she came away from it, the acknowledgement was that she was going to have a lot more choices like this going forward in her life. And yet now she had this information and this perspective that she would not have gotten if they had taken an authoritative stance towards that behavior, if they had just gotten mad and tried to shut it down and tried to prohibit it without, giving her the information she needed to make those choices going forward. And so moving, as the teen gets older, especially moving from this authoritative position, or using our authority with more strength, to negotiating and collaborating and informing, allows us to keep open the lines of communication with our teen. And so with this mother, after we kind of talked about it and practiced how she wanted to talk with her daughter, then she had a really fruitful discussion with the daughter where she acknowledged the daughter's authority in making decisions going forward, and how important it was to her that the daughter be able to talk with her about anything that could happen as she moved on to college, anything that came up that was concerning to her. We basically facilitated a conversation on the risks of sexual assault on college campuses, and how important it would be for the mom that daughter would be able to come to her if she ever saw anything concerning, or if something ever concerning ever happened to her, and how much more important it was to the mom to have those open lines of communication on those core issues than it is to be able to fight one battle and win over a child's behavior at that age. Now, all of that is really oriented towards these areas, these gray areas of teenage life where they're making decisions we don't like, and yet we realize that it's no longer our place to intervene. This is intervene with that kind of authoritative stance. It is not. It does not apply to like regular substance use or addictive video game use that's causing them to fail semesters of school. In those areas, while contingency management still involves a lot of collaboration, the weight of parental authority still has to be the determining factor, because once a kid develops a behavior that is that addictive, their own authority is compromised enough that they need the parent to intervene in a different way. And so I just want to make that distinction. In this talk, I'm trying to talk about core principles for parenting that apply in some way. And I know kids are so diverse, and not everything I will say will apply to every kid, but to the mid-range of kind of normal developing kids who haven't developed a addictive problem. I'm not talking about addiction right now. Now, when we do transition from this, from a more authoritative stance to a more collaborative stance with our teens, we still have a ton of leverage. And that leverage is what we can use to keep our conflicts with the team impersonal and to negotiate for the things that are most important to us. And so right now I'm going to spend about 10 minutes going over the core principles of effective contingency management. And then I'm going to open it up to questions. And then these principles of contingency management we're going to apply in the next two webinars, once on next week on the scheduling with teens, how to use contingency management to try to effectively schedule our teens and get them to do the basic things we need them to do, like get their schoolwork done and sleep is going to be one of the main focuses. And then in the following, we'll talk about contingency management for addictive problems. So one of the most important things is to pick your battles. There's a lot of things we might want our teens to do better or differently, but there's only so many we're going to be able to affect. We cannot micromanage every area of our child's life. So we have to think about what's most important to us and what we think is most important to their healthy development. When we identify that area, we want to lead with empathy. We want to sit down and say, hey, things are not working in you getting to school on time, and we've got to figure out a solution. Tell me about it from your perspective. Like what has been the struggle? Why do you think this has been so difficult? Get the teen engaged, empathetically as a starting point. It doesn't mean you're going to agree with anything they say or their perspective, but it's important, like in all our relationships, that people be heard and have a voice to be able to talk about their perspective. And then when you start to design a contingency about those things that you consider most important, and again, it will be different in every family, use whatever motivates your teen. If your teen is motivated by technology, then you're going to have to use technology as a reinforcer. If they're motivated by being able to go out and spend time with friends, then you got to use that as a reinforcer. And by using it as a reinforcer, it's not hitting them over the head with it, like, oh well, we have control over your phone, we have control over whether you leave, and now we're going to use that to get you to do what we want. There is a sense in which that's true, but in contingency management, it's much more reasonable, because what you're basically saying is, you're spending all this time on a screen, and now we've got to set up a system where the things that you can do, the things you need to do, and then do the things you want to do. And so, I'll give a couple examples, but I want to give a couple more principles first. You got to make the contingencies very simple, clear, and easily enforceable. One of my pet peeves in the treatment industry is getting kids coming out of residential treatment, and they all come home with these contracts. And basically, it's a laundry list of 100 things that are overly general, like, I'm going to respect my parents, I'm going to keep my room clean all the time. Basically, it's a laundry list of behaviors that we would ascribe to the perfect teen. If the perfect teen did all these things, then we would think we were living in heaven. And then they sign it. And you're like, you can't contract to have the perfect teen. Like that's not the way contracting works. Plus, the things are generally unenforceable and unmeasurable and overly general. So you want to pick a very specific behavior, and you want to choose a contingency that is simple and easily enforceable. So, for example, and there's a lot of different ways to do contingency plans, but those principles hold. So you want your kid to be up by 11 o'clock on the weekend, or 10 o'clock, or 9 o'clock, whatever you decide is important to you. And they really love using the car. But you say, okay, if you're up by 10 o'clock and you come see me on a Saturday morning, then you have car privilege that day. It's easily enforceable. The consequence directly follows the desired behavior. And if they wake up at 10:30 and you'd set the requirement for 10, then they just don't use the car that day. But when that day is over, it's over, right? The contingency has been enforced. It's obvious it will have had an effect on them, and then you move on. You keep it impersonal on that day when they do sleep till 10:30, and they get up and they come to you and say, oh, but I've got this thing I really got to go to, and now they're going to try to personalize it. You should have told me, or it's your fault because of this, and they get real personal about it. And then you implement it as best you can impersonally, and you treat it as, hey, this is the agreement in the house. Today you won't have the car. And in order to really make contingencies work with teenagers, you have to be willing to endure a tantrum. You cannot save the teen from every tantrum they will have when they run up against a consequence that they agreed to, that they knew well, was the requirement, and they didn't quite get it. So they're facing the consequences, they're feeling the negative emotion, and they want to change the outcome. And there's another word for all of that, and it's called learning. If we rescue our teen from every negative emotion that they experience, no matter how dramatically they express it to us, because they face a consequence that they weren't able to avert, they learn from it. And they won't learn from it if we protect them from that. And so we can't rob our teen of the ability to learn because we don't want to have to witness a tantrum. Tantrums about this sort of thing don't hurt children. The volatile expression of emotion about whether they can use the car or not will look like it's hurting them, but it doesn't hurt them. Now, although you don't want to save a teen from a teen tantrum over something that they lost, you do want to be willing to go back to the table with them to renegotiate as they get older. Things will change. Curfews will need to be adjusted. Maybe the plan's just not working for them and they need to voice their concerns again. So outside of the enforcement of a consequence, being able to go back to the table with them is important. This could have been at the very beginning of the list, but know yourself. All of us none of us are perfect parents, and none of us, will use our authority perfectly. We all tend generally to be a little bit more rigid or a little bit more permissive, or a lot more rigid or a lot more permissive. Sometimes we're a little bit more rigid with one kid and a little bit more permissive with another kid. We need to think about, what our tendencies are and basically try to balance those. And if we parent with a partner, chances are we tend in the opposite direction. I mean, at least the families that come into my office, generally there's a more permissive parent and a more rigid parent. And, but both of them are generally in the middle or on the spectrum of normal. And one of the things that I work with, couples to realize and acknowledge on this issue and on other issues is that being different, even on really important issues like this, if I'm a little bit more permissive because that's the way that I learned growing up and it worked for me, and that's just the way that I see the world, that we give more authority to the teen earlier on, and I came from a more authoritarian background, etc., that usually those different preferences are within the range of normal, and finding a compromise is usually a very healthy place to get, where I'm not exactly doing it the way I want to, but my partner's also not doing it exactly the way they want to. And all of those bring up issues that are complex in the family system and can be difficult to unravel. And so get help if you need it. I'll tell you what, if you think about that, what I'm talking about, you're like, that's impossible, Ned. We can't do contingency management in our house. It just wouldn't work. It would be too hard. It would be too hard to implement. Then come into the office and get help from one of us to put together a contingency plan. It can be a lot easier to depersonalize and engage in the type of negotiation that we're talking about with a teen when you have a facilitator, especially if there's a long history of personalization and power struggles, because it creates a new space and a new way of talking about the issues. And usually teens really like it when they enter into a conversation where their authority is given. I always ask the teen first to talk and tell me their perspective and tell me the things that are important to them. And when they have that voice, now I can hear what the parents want from them. They become a lot more reasonable in that setting. And so get the help if you need it to set up a contingency plan. It can pay big dividends over time, even though it will need to be continually updated and managed. And as with all compromises, it's probably working if no one got everything they wanted. That's one of the things about contingency management. Usually both the parents and the teens walk away feeling like they wish they had gotten more, and that's good. That really shows that they're respecting that one another each has authority in the teen's life and not trying to subsume authority entirely for themselves. A teen that subsumes authority entirely for themselves during those years can lead to disaster. And a parent who it doesn't allow the teen to develop their authority effectively can lead to really unhealthy behaviors in the teen too. Like I said, like subversive behaviors, lying and sneaking and such. And so, we don't want to err in one direction or the other. And we always want to kind of try to, because we will go off course, we always want to try to steer ourselves back towards the middle. All right. So I've already talked about this multiple times, so I won't say it again. September 16th, Julia Katzman will apply some of these principles to sleep and schedules with your teen. And then on the 23rd, we will address the even more difficult problems of addiction, which you would think, oh gosh, you can really apply these same principles to addiction. That's what we do day in and day out. And it is amazing to see the transformation that kids go through from extremely volatile about defending their substance use to engaging and complying with a contingency management plan. It's one of the most rewarding parts of the work that I do is to watch those changes. And then, like I said, because I think there will be there's a lot of interest in these topics, we're also going to try to set up a time where people can just come together and just talk and ask questions and share ideas about parenting teens.